Soft winds rolled through the tall pines as dawn broke across the quiet stretch of forgotten land she called home. The cabin sat far from town, tucked between rough hills and an old stream that no longer ran steady. Most folks didn't even know the place existed anymore, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Life away from the world meant no questions, no old memories rising up, no fresh pain tearing open scars she worked so hard to hide. Some said isolation was lonely, but to her it felt safer than trusting people who came and went like passing storms. She lived with simple routines: stitching torn blankets, tending a small garden that barely fed her through winter, and mending tools left behind by travelers long ago. Everything had its place. Silence was her shelter. She believed life had already taken enough from her, so she stopped giving anything back. The world could move on without her. The only companion she allowed was an old loyal dog that had wandered into her life a year back. He carried a calm strength in his eyes, standing guard outside the cabin each night. Sometimes she wondered if he felt the same kind of quiet hurt she carried, the kind that keeps a soul distant even when company is near. He never demanded anything, never forced closeness, and in that way, he suited her just fine. Nights were the hardest. Contentment faded into long shadows that crawled across the wooden walls, and silence turned heavy. She'd sit near the oil lamp, hands folded, staring at the flame as if it held all the answers she was too afraid to ask. She wondered if her heart still had the strength to care for another human being. She wondered if she even deserved that chance again. Each time the thought came, she pushed it away, reminding herself she wasn't meant for anything more than quiet survival. But fate often visits when a soul stops believing. The storm rolled in without warning one late evening. The wind knocked branches against the cabin walls, and thunder shook the ground like something wild trying to break free. She sat beside the fire, listening to the wild night, grateful that she was alone and safe behind thick logs and locked doors. The world outside was chaos, while in her isolated space, everything stayed still. Then the dog growled. Not the casual warning bark he sometimes gave to passing coyotes, but a sharp, deep sound that sent a chill down her spine. She stood, steadying her breath, and edged toward the door. The storm screamed across the land, rain beating like hail. When she opened the door, lightning flashed across a muddy trail, revealing something she never expected to see. A man collapsed near the fence line. He lay motionless, clothes torn, dirt and blood mixing into the soaked ground. She hesitated, heart racing. She had promised herself she wouldn't let strangers close again. She wouldn't carry the weight of other people's stories. But the sight of him stirred something long buried, something human, something compassionate. Maybe she wasn't as numb as she believed. She hurried through the rain and knelt beside him. He was barely conscious, breath shallow, skin cold. She didn't know who he was or how he ended up near her cabin. She only knew leaving him there meant letting life slip away. And despite everything she tried to shut down, she couldn't ignore a suffering soul right in front of her. With effort, she dragged him inside, the dog following close with restless eyes. Once he was on the bed, she lit more lamps, dried his soaked clothes, and cleaned the long gash running across his arm. The cut looked like it came from barbed wire or rough metal, not the usual wounds from an animal. She worked carefully, hands steady even though her thoughts were shaking. He groaned low, eyes fluttering open. For a moment he seemed confused, searching the room as though waking in a place both strange and familiar. His gaze finally settled on her. There was something in his eyes that made her chest tighten, not from fear, but from a strange pull she couldn't explain. Like a memory she had forgotten, or a connection she never agreed to feel. He tried to speak, but only a whisper slipped out, so faint she could barely hear it. "You found me." She paused. The words startled her more than the storm. Found him. She didn't know him. She didn't know where he came from or why he was here. Still, she swallowed the questions and tightened the bandage on his arm. "You need rest," she said softly. "Don't try to talk." He closed his eyes, though the tension in his face showed whatever he carried wasn't just physical pain. Outside, the storm kept roaring, shaking the cabin like nature itself was warning her that this moment would change everything she built. Hours passed before she stepped back from his side, hands trembling slightly. She sat at the table, staring at him across the room. It felt strange having someone lying in her bed, breathing in the same quiet space she once guarded so carefully. Part of her wanted to push him back out into the world once the storm passed, pretend none of this happened. But another part, a softer part, she thought she buried, wasn't ready to let go. The dog lay near the bed, alert yet calm, as if he sensed something sacred happening as night faded into early dawn. A pale light slipped through the window, shining across the man's face. She noticed a small marking on a piece of metal tied around his neck, hidden beneath torn fabric. She lifted it gently, eyes narrowing as she recognized a faint symbol etched into it. A symbol she had seen once long ago, a story she spent years trying to forget. Her hands froze. This wasn't just a stranger who washed up on her land. There was a reason. He ended up at her cabin. Something that linked him to her past. Something she'd never expected to face again. She stepped back, breath tight, quiet life slipping away like smoke from a dying flame. The storm outside finally calmed, but inside her heart, a different storm began. One that whispered an unsettling truth. He wasn't lost by accident, and whatever bond tied their lives together had been waiting a long time to surface. No matter how far she ran from the world, the morning settled into a cold quiet. The kind that clung to the air after a long storm. She moved softly around the cabin, keeping her distance from the stranger, though her eyes returned to him every few moments. He still lay asleep, breathing slow and steady beneath the quilt she stitched last winter. The marking on the metal pendant rested just beneath his collarbone now. Tucked away, but the image refused to leave her mind. She thought she had buried everything tied to that symbol, locked it away like the rest of her past. But fate had a different way of calling things back to the surface. She kept working, sweeping the floor, tending to embers in the stove, anything to stop her thoughts from drifting too deep. The dog sat near the door, ears perked, watching her as if he felt the shift in the air. She tried to ignore the uneasy feeling, but it stayed close, like an unwelcome shadow. By mid-morning, the stranger stirred. His breath changed first, then his shoulders tightened as though dreams clung to him longer than they should. She sat at the edge of the table and waited. When he finally opened his eyes, the room felt smaller, as if both of them were suddenly aware of each other and the silence between them. He looked around, brow furrowed as he tried to gather where he was. His gaze met hers again, steady and searching. She took a slow breath and spoke before he could ask anything. "You're safe here. You were hurt and nearly frozen when I found you. Rest is what you need." He blinked, throat dry. "How long have I been here?" "You came just before the storm hit. You've been unconscious most of the night." He nodded faintly, trying to sit up. Pain forced him back down. She stepped forward to help, but stopped herself when she felt her hands start to tremble. It was easy to be gentle when he was silent, easier to treat injuries when he wasn't looking at her like she was familiar. Now, every move felt heavy, like each step pulled her toward something she wasn't ready to face. "You should stay still," she said quietly. "Your arm needs time." Whatever happened, it cut deep. His eyes lowered. "I didn't mean to trouble you. I didn't do it for thanks." Flicker of confusion crossed his face again. He turned his head slightly, taking in the cabin. The light streaming through the window, the dog sitting close by like a silent guard. Something like relief washed over him, but there was caution too, a hidden weight pressing on his thoughts. The dog finally stood and approached, sniffing his hand. The stranger lifted his fingers weakly to pet him, and though his touch was gentle, the dog watched him with the same slow judgment she did. "You live out here alone?" he asked softly. She hesitated. Questions like that always scraped at old wounds. "For the most part," she answered. "Not many people come this way, but I did." His words held meaning he didn't explain. Her heart tightened again. She stayed quiet. He looked down at the pendant near his collarbone, fingers brushing over the faded metal as though it grounded him. For a moment, she wondered if he remembered her noticing it, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he closed his eyes and leaned back, breathing slow, as though exhaustion pulled at his bones. She stepped away and busied herself preparing a simple meal. As the scent of warm broth filled the room, her thoughts drifted back to memories she worked hard to silence. Years ago, when life still felt bright and full of promise, she lived closer to town. She had people around her, people she trusted, people she believed cared for her. That world ended the day she learned trust could vanish in a single moment, leaving only broken pieces behind. She left everything behind after that, retreating to the hills where no one could find her. She told herself she wouldn't look back, but the symbol on his pendant carried a past she once shared. It belonged to a small group of families connected by land disputes, hard winters, and one tragic event that changed everything. She remembered that symbol carved on wooden crates, lined up along dusty roads, on letters that never reached their destination. On the coat of a rider she watched disappear into the distance on the night everything fell apart. She tried to forget. She promised to forget. And now it was back, lying in her bed, breathing under her roof. Why him? Why now? The stranger finally spoke again, voice low and rough. You looked like you recognized something when you saw this. He lifted the pendant slightly. Her heartbeat stumbled. She set the bowl down and turned away. Just finish healing. That's all that matters right now. I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door. You don't know what kind of trouble that could be? He watched her carefully, studying her as if he wanted to understand more than she wanted to reveal. She felt exposed, like the walls she built over the years had cracks she never noticed before. She tightened her jaw and kept her distance, hoping he would drift back to sleep. But he stayed awake, staring at the ceiling as if counting memories she couldn't see outside. The world settled into a calm hush. The land around the cabin always felt untouched after rain, like nature washed everything clean. Yet inside, nothing felt washed clean. If anything, the storm had brought something to the surface that refused to fade. Late afternoon brought another shift. He tried to sit up again, this time more determined. She moved closer reluctantly, supporting his shoulder so he wouldn't tear the bandage. He breathed slow, eyes fixed on hers, so testing whether he could trust the silence between them. She thought about asking who he was, how he ended up wounded so far from any road, why he carried that symbol, and what brought him to her land. But each question felt dangerous. It's like pulling on a loose thread that might unravel everything she worked to keep still. Instead, she asked the safest thing she could. Do you have somewhere you need to get back to? He stared at the floor before answering. I was traveling to find someone. I didn't think the trail would lead me here. Her skin prickled. You were looking for a person or a place? His voice dropped. A person. She swallowed, forcing herself not to step back. And did you find them? He met her eyes with the kind of truth that shook her more than any storm. I don't know yet. The words felt like a spark hitting dry grass. He wasn't speaking about the wound. He wasn't speaking about shelter. There was something deeper there, something tied to the past she refused to open. She turned away quickly, hiding the sudden rush of emotion that rose without warning. Night began to settle again.
Oh.
Long shadows stretching across the cabin floor. The dog curled up near the bed, still watchful, as though sensing that the stranger's arrival marked the start of something larger than any of them understood. She stood by the window, arms folded tightly, staring into the fading light outside. For years she believed she had escaped the world, escaped loss, escaped people. Now a single wounded traveler had crossed her path and shifted. Everything she told herself was true. Maybe he would leave once he regained his strength. Maybe this was nothing more than a passing moment, or maybe the past she ran from had finally caught up to her, and the bond she never wanted to face was only beginning to reveal itself. The next few days settled into a strained rhythm that never quite felt like peace. The stranger slept in broken stretches, waking with flashes of pain and half-spoken words that faded before she could piece them together. Each time he stirred, she was there with water, broth, or a cool cloth, moving with the careful grace of someone used to tending wounds alone. Yet the more she helped him, the more she felt the walls inside herself press tighter, as if every small kindness pulled her further from the safe distance. she had sworn to keep. The land outside the cabin seemed to watch with its own silent patience. The trail that led from the hills to her door showed signs of more than storm damage. Hoofprints cut deep into the soft earth near the fence, fresher than the stranger's tracks. She noticed them one morning when she stepped outside to gather wood. Someone else had ridden through in the night, close, but not close enough to knock. The dog sniffed the ground, fur bristling, then lifted his head toward the distant ridge with a low, uneasy sound. It felt less like chance and more like something closing in. Inside, the stranger's strength returned bit by bit. His arms stayed stiff, but he could sit upright without help now. Sometimes she found him trying to swing his feet to the floor. She scolded him each time, though the edge in her voice came more from fear than anger. If he pushed too hard, the wound might tear. If he left too soon, the questions would follow him down the trail and haunt her until they found their way back. One evening, as the sky shifted into amber and the shadows grew longer, he watched her move about the cabin. Eyes tracing the shelves, the handmade tools, the neat jars of dried herbs. There was a story in every small thing, and he seemed to notice all of it. "You lived in town once?" he said quietly. "I can tell." She paused, fingers resting on a metal cup. "What makes you think that?" "You keep things careful but not careless. You have touches that come from somewhere busier than this place. The way those jars are labeled, the stitching on that quilt. People who grow up far from others usually don't learn that kind of detail." His words unsettled her. He spoke like he had spent time watching people, reading them the way others read newspapers. She tried not to show how close he was to the truth. "Town is nothing for me now," she answered. "I prefer it out here on the frontier. The land is clearer than people." "That may be," he said, studying her face, "but the land carries memory too. Tracks don't vanish just because you want them to." She set the cup down harder than she meant to. "You talk like a man who knows how to follow more than one kind of trail." He held her gaze. "Maybe I do." Tension settled between them like another presence in the cabin. The dog shifted, restless, then settled again, his eyes moving from one to the other. They were two people bound by something neither wanted to name yet. Both guarding old hurts that refused to stay buried. Later that night, when the stranger slept again, she sat by the fire and let her mind travel back to the conflict that drove her into hiding. It had started as a simple land dispute along the valley. Lines on paper that did not match the lines families had walked for generations. A company from the east sent men with crisp clothes and sharp ledgers, claiming rights to water and grazing soil. They brought deeds and documents, saying the old ways of sharing land meant nothing against ink and signature. Her family resisted. So did a few others. Voices rose in the meeting hall. Tempers sparked like flint. One night, fences were cut and livestock scattered. No one could prove who did it, but blame moved faster than truth. A barn burned. Shots were fired in the dark. By morning, someone she loved lay still in the dirt, and the symbol she now saw on the stranger's pendant marked the wagon of the man who rode away, just ahead of trouble. That symbol belonged to those who believed gold and paper meant more than roots in the earth. Or at least that was what she convinced herself when she packed what she could and disappeared into the hills. She shut out everyone tied to that world, good or bad, choosing quiet over the risk of more loss. Now that same mark lay inches from her hand each time. She changed the stranger's bandage. The next day brought a new thread to the growing knot. While she checked the snares near the creek, the dog froze, ears forward, and gave a sharp bark toward the trees. She followed his gaze and saw a rider in the distance, just a shadow moving across the ridge. The figure did not come closer, only paused long enough to scan the valley, then disappeared behind a rise. It was far enough that she could not see his face or his horse clearly, yet close enough to send a cold prickle across her arms. When she returned to the cabin, the stranger was awake, sitting carefully at the edge of the bed. He studied her expression. "Something out there?" he asked. "Just the usual," she lied. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You aren't the usual kind of woman to look shaken by empty trees." She busied herself with the stove. "You're not the usual kind of traveler to bleed near a cabin like this. Yet here we are," gave a tired half smile. Fair enough. Silence followed, thick as the smoke curling from the chimney. The main conflict between them had no clear name yet, but it showed itself in every glance, every question left unanswered. She wanted to protect her quiet life, the small sense of safety she carved out of loneliness. He wanted something that pulled him straight into the heart of her past, a past she thought she could outrun. That night, sleep refused her. She lay on the small cot near the stove, staring at the ceiling. Rustles in the brush outside, the hoot of an owl, the low breath of the stranger, all threaded through the darkness. The dog occasionally lifted his head, listening, then lowered it again. The cabin felt like a little boat floating alone on a dark sea of pines and hills. And she could not shake the feeling that the water around them was beginning to move. At some point, the stranger spoke into the dim light. "I think I owe you more than thanks," he said. "You gave me shelter when I had no right to expect it. Maybe you deserve to know what you pulled into your home." She remained quiet, but her eyes were open. She did not stop him. "I worked for a freight outfit that hauls supplies between towns," he said. "But that's not the full truth. The man who owns the company also deals in land and timber. He carries that symbol on his wagons. I suppose you noticed." Her throat tightened. "I've seen it before," she answered. "I figured." Wincing shifted carefully, wincing. "Some of us started to realize the routes we rode weren't just about moving goods. We were carrying messages, contracts, sometimes men who were not afraid to force folks off their land. Not all the riders knew. Some didn't care. Did. I signed on to work, not to help push people out of their homes." His voice carried a hard honesty that tugged at her instinct to trust him, and that scared her. She did not want to trust anyone tied to that symbol. "When I spoke up," he went on, "I was told to keep riding and keep quiet. I didn't. I started warning families along the trail what was coming. I told them to hide their papers and watch who they dealt with. Someone found out. The last thing I remember before I ended up on your land is a wagon overturned near the ridge, horses screaming, someone shouting for me not to move, then nothing but the storm." She listened to every word, feeling parts of the old anger shift in ways she did not like. If he told the truth, he was caught between worlds, much like she was. A man tied to the very force that shattered her life, yet trying to break away from it. "You say you were traveling to find someone," she said at last. "Who?" He hesitated, eyes flicking to her face, then to the low flames in the stove. "A woman whose family was hurt by the company? Someone who vanished after everything that happened. I heard pieces of her story in different towns. A woman who left behind a house near the valley and built a life where no one could reach her. I needed to find her, to tell her something she never heard the night everything fell apart." Her heart hammered so loud she wondered if he could hear it. "And what is that?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "That it wasn't as simple as it looked," he said. "And that someone on the inside has been fighting for her without her knowing." The air in the cabin thinned. It felt like the old world and the new stood side by side, waiting for her to choose which one to step into. Her deepest conflict rose clean and sharp. She wanted to send him away, to lock the door and return to her quiet days. She also wanted to hear every detail of what he knew, every hidden piece of the story that had kept her awake for years. Before she could decide, the dog sprang to his feet with a snarl, facing the door. Hoofbeats thundered faintly from the distance. Growing louder, someone was finally coming up the trail. The stranger's eyes hardened, and his hand went instinctively toward where a gun holster might have been, if he still had it. She felt the old fear grip her chest, and at the same time, a fierce protective fire, she thought. She had lost. Whatever bond tied her to the wounded man and the world she tried to leave. Behind was no longer just a quiet mystery in her cabin. It was riding straight toward her door, carrying questions, danger, and truths that could break the fragile shelter she built around her heart. The sound of hoofbeats grew clearer, rolling through the valley like thunder, trapped in the earth. She stood frozen, one hand gripping the table, while the other hovered near the latch of the cabin door. The dog paced back and forth, fur stiff, tail low, ready to defend. The stranger pushed himself to sit upright despite the pain tugging at his arm. jaw clenched as though every instinct told him to stand between danger and the woman who saved his life. She whispered sharply, "Don't get up. You're in no shape to face anything out there." He shook his head, voice low. "If they followed me, they won't stop at the door. They'll want something, and what do you think that is?" she asked, his eyes darkened with memory. "Proof that I betrayed them. Proof that I talked to the wrong people. Maybe they think I'm carrying documents or names. Maybe they think I know too much." Bitter chill slid through her. For years she believed she could outrun the past by hiding deeper in the hills. Now it felt like everything she tried to escape had found a path straight to her door because of him. The hoofbeats slowed, growing cautious, then stopped altogether. Silence followed, too heavy to feel empty. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Then a faint voice carried through the wind. "Ma'am, we're looking for a man. He might be wounded. Might have passed through here." Stranger's eyes flicked to hers, a warning without words. She motioned for him to stay silent. No matter how much anger she held toward her past, she couldn't shake the instinct to protect someone bleeding in her care. Not again. She stepped toward the door, trying to steady her voice. "This is private land. I don't take to visitors without reason." Slow creak sounded outside. Metal shifting, like someone shifting the weight of a rifle. "Reason is exactly why we're here." The dog growled, low and steady. She placed a hand on his neck, urging calm. Fear pulsed inside her, but something stronger rose with it. A kind of quiet courage she forgot she still had. When she opened the door, just enough to see, two riders sat on nervous horses near the tree line. They weren't dressed like lawmen or travelers. Their clothes were too fine, boots too polished, coats too clean for men who lived off the frontier. The symbol she recognized marked the saddle of one horse, burned into the leather like a brand of ownership. Her chest tightened. She kept her voice plain. "Storm brought down my fence and half my woodshed. Haven't had time to deal with strangers too." The rider leaned forward. His face held a strange calm, like a man who hid threats behind pleasant words. "We lost a rider last night. We're tracking him. He could be trouble. If you've seen him, it'd be best to speak up." She held steady. "Only trouble here comes from the storm. You'll need to move along if you're looking for anything else." The man stared at her a moment, eyes narrowing. He glanced past her, toward the cabin windows, as if trying to see inside. She stayed firm, blocking his view with her body. Something inside her sparked with old fury, memories of meetings where men like him spoke with polite voices while stealing the earth. Under people's feet, after a tense pause, the rider finally tipped his hat. "If you see anyone, you send word. Folks like you shouldn't get caught up in business that doesn't belong to them." The remark hit like a warning. She didn't answer. The two men turned their horses and rode off slowly, glancing back more than once, as though uncertain whether to trust her word. Only when their silhouettes faded behind the hill did she close the door, lock it tight. The stranger watched her from the bed. His gaze wasn't just grateful, it carried something deeper, something that acknowledged the risk she had just taken. "You didn't have to lie for me," he said softly. She dropped into a chair, exhausted. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because I know what men like them leave behind when they get what they want." He studied her silently, then nodded. She didn't tell him how close she came to walking outside with a rifle, how she could have faced them not just with caution but with anger sharpened by years of loss. She hated that feeling, hated that he had brought it back. Later, when the sun lowered and scattered light through the dusty room, the stranger spoke again. Voice weak but certain, "I need to leave before they return." She felt the words like a stone dropped into still water, ripples moving through thoughts she didn't want to admit. Part of her knew he was right. Part of her didn't want him gone. Another part feared that if he left, he'd take unanswered truths with him forever. "You can't ride," she said. "Not yet. You'd bleed halfway down the trail." "I can't stay either," he replied. "You'll be in danger because of me." She turned away, staring at the flickering lamp. "Danger came to my door long before you did. It just finally had a face again." The air between them thickened with unspoken things. He shifted, trying to stand, and she rushed to steady him. When their hands met, Something passed between them so quietly it barely made a sound. A closeness she hadn't felt in years. A warmth she wasn't ready for. He whispered, "You shouldn't have to live like this." She stepped back quickly, breath shaking. "You don't know how I should live? You don't know enough." He nodded, accepting her walls. "Then tell me what I'm missing." She almost did. The memory rose sharp and painful, her voice ready to speak the truth. She buried the night her world collapsed. But instead she shook her head. "Not yet." He didn't press. Days passed, tension growing like a storm that refused to break. She reinforced the fence, gathered supplies, and kept watch on the ridge. At night she sat awake by the fire while he slept, wondering if leaving the world had been strength or surrender. One night, while she tended the embers, he spoke from the shadows. "I think I found you for a reason," he said. "Not just because I was running." She kept her back to him, afraid to face the weight of his words. "Reasons don't change the past." "No," he said, voice steady. "But they can change where the past leads." She closed her eyes. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe the world had not ended the night she walked away from it. Before she could answer, hoofbeats echoed again. This time there were more. The dog growled at the same moment lanterns flickered outside the window. Voices carried through the dark, louder and sharper. The riders had returned, and they hadn't come quietly. The man pushed himself up, ready to fight despite his weakness. She reached for her rifle, grip steady even though her heart beat like fire in her chest. The conflict she spent years avoiding had finally found her doorstep. Not as memory, but as men on horseback, ready to tear open the truth she refused to face. The stranger looked at her, eyes burning with determination and something more. Something that felt like fate tying their paths together, whether she chose it or not. Outside, someone shouted her name. They had not come for him alone. They had come for her too, and the past she thought she buried in the woods was about to demand answers. The voices outside carried a sharp edge that cut through the night. Lanterns swung between the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin as horses pawed at the ground. She stood still, rifle pressed against her shoulder, steady even though her pulse raced. The stranger moved to stand beside her, one hand gripping the table for balance, refusing to sit back down. The dog stayed in front of them both, teeth bared. "Ready to protect?" "Stay behind me," she whispered. "I won't let them take you," he answered. For a moment they simply breathed, waiting for the first move. Then the riders called out again, but this time the voice was stronger, less threatening, more desperate. "We know you're out here. We want the land records." Those documents were stolen and passed through this valley. Her eyes narrowed. Land records was a phrase she hadn't heard in years, not since she walked away from the conflict that tore families apart. The stranger looked toward her, realization dawning. "You have them," he whispered. "You kept proof." She swallowed hard. She had hidden those papers under loose boards beneath the cabin floor long ago, thinking no one would ever come looking again. They weren't just land records. They were signatures, maps, names, proof of broken agreements. Proof that the land belonged to the families who bled for it, not the company that tried to claim it. She thought she was holding on to them out of stubbornness, but now she understood that these papers weren't only hers to keep. They were what the stranger had been searching for. The missing truth he tried to warn others about. The riders outside grew impatient. One of them dismounted, boots crunching on wet soil. "Open the door, or we'll break it down." She stepped closer to the stranger and spoke in a quiet tone. "If they take the records, half the families who left will never be able to return home, and the truth dies with them. That's why I came," he said softly, "to make sure the truth reached the right hands." He looked at her in a way that left no room for doubt. He was ready to fight, not for himself, but for the people both of them had lost, for the land she fled, for the lives scattered across the valley. She lowered her rifle slightly. Not in surrender, but in decision. "I'm tired of running," she said. He nodded once. "Then let's end it together." She moved quickly to the floorboard, peeled it back, and pulled out the wrapped bundle of papers. Dust clung to the edges, but the writing remained clear enough to speak louder than any weapon. She handed them to him and felt a quiet relief, like she was finally setting down a weight she carried for too many years. Outside, the door shook under a hard shove. He glanced toward the noise, then toward her. "We can't hold them here. We have to confront them in the open." She hesitated. The cabin had been her shelter, the last place she allowed herself to be human. But now she realized that walls kept out danger and kept life out too. If she wanted a future, she had to step outside and claim it. They stepped out together, the dog racing ahead to guard their front. The lantern swung toward them, men startled to see the door open willingly. She stood firm beside the stranger, holding no fear in her voice. "These papers belong to the families of this land," she said. "Not to the company. Not to men who hide behind threats and lies." The leader urged his horse forward. "You think you can stand against a whole operation with a handful of ink and old stories?" The stranger held the papers high, so the firelight revealed the signatures. Not just stories, proof, enough to take to the courts, enough to expose every forced eviction and burned barn. Enough that the owners you work for will answer to the law instead of gunmen. The man stared, jaw tight, knowing the moment had shifted. He could fight bullets and fear, but ink had a way of traveling far beyond the hills. No, all the way to judges and officials who owed no loyalty to his kind. Another rider shook his head, backing away first. "We're not paid enough to get tied up in this. Let's ride out." A few men followed him, wheels of doubt turning fast. Someone tossed down a lantern and kicked his horse into motion. The leader cursed under his breath, realizing the fight had left with them. He stared at the stranger, then at her, face twisted with anger he could no longer hide. This isn't over. But he still turned his horse and rode into the trees, disappearing toward town, leaving the valley quiet again. The night wind shifted, brushing her hair back, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. She stood still, rifle lowered, breath unsteady. The stranger finally let out a slow exhale, his body relaxing as though the fight drained what little strength he had left. "It's over for now," she said quietly. "But not forever," he replied. "There will be trials, arguments, more people trying to twist the truth. These papers need to reach the right place, and we will have to stand with them." She nodded, but what surprised her most was that she felt ready. Not because she sought revenge or wanted to return to old wounds, but because she finally understood that healing came from facing the past, not hiding from it. They returned inside the cabin as dawn crept over the hills. She helped him sit, then wrapped the papers safely again. He watched her with a softness that no longer carried confusion or fear. "I wasn't looking for just any woman," he said. "I was looking for the one who never stopped protecting what was right, even when she walked away from everyone." She lowered her gaze, hands stilling on the cloth. "I thought I left because I was broken. Maybe I left because I knew I couldn't fight alone. You don't have to anymore." His words settled in her like warmth after a long winter. The dog climbed onto the bed beside him, nuzzling his arm, as if claiming him as part of their small world. Days later, when he could finally stand without help, they packed supplies and prepared to travel back toward the valley. Not to reclaim old lives, but to rebuild something new. She walked outside, looking at the hills that once protected her from everything. Now they felt like a border she no longer needed to hide behind. He joined her, still moving carefully, and stood close enough that their shoulders brushed. "You ready?" She took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." They started down the trail together, the dog trotting ahead, tail high, as if guiding them forward. The air felt lighter, the world wider than it had in years. She no longer carried her past alone. The stranger beside her wasn't just someone she rescued. He was someone connected to her story. Someone who brought truth back into the light, and she, once isolated to avoid suffering, finally stepped toward a future where hope mattered again. They didn't look back at the cabin until the trail curved and it disappeared from sight. She smiled softly, knowing the quiet life she built there didn't end. It simply grew into something bigger. The land stretched ahead, open and waiting, just like their story.